Picture Kirkcaldy on a grey Scottish morning, the North Sea breathing salt against stone. Inside, a scholar bends over paper, not yet knowing nations will listen. The first known reference to the project came when Adam Smith told David Hume he had begun a book to pass away the time. That sounds almost casual, a pastime, a way to fill empty hours. But the book growing under his hand would teach governments how to count. Adam Smith was born in Kirkcaldy in 1723, a small Fife town whose harbor opened his childhood toward trade, weather, risk, and distance. At 14, Smith entered the University of Glasgow, where he absorbed the Scottish Enlightenment's restless habit, ask how society actually works. Scotland then was poor beside England, but intellectually alive. Ministers, chemists, jurists, merchants, and philosophers argued over improvement like it was weather. Before economics made him famous, Smith published The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, a book about sympathy, judgment, conscience, and social feeling. So before Smith asked why nations grow rich, he asked why people care what others think of them. Pause. That matters more than the slogans admit. The Wealth of Nations appeared on March 9, 1776, the same revolutionary year when imperial power began cracking across the Atlantic. The book runs across 5 books and more than 1,000 pages, dense with labor, trade, taxation, empire, prices, and public debt. It is not a manifesto you can fit on a mug. It is an investigation, patient and often irritated, into the machinery beneath daily life. Smith developed many core ideas at Glasgow, where he had been student, professor, and later rector, returning in memory even while writing elsewhere. His most famous image begins almost ridiculously small. Not gold, not kings, not conquest. Pins. Tiny metal pins, multiplied by human coordination. One worker draws wire, another straightens it, another cuts, another points, another heads. A simple object becomes a lesson in social organization. Britannica calls the Wealth of Nations the first comprehensive system of political economy, but stresses Smith remained a broader social philosopher. Political economy meant more than money. It meant grain prices, soldier pay, colonial charters, apprenticeships, roads, schools, and the power hiding inside rules. Smith watched a world obsessed with bullion, tariffs, and monopolies. Governments treated commerce like a locked chest. He looked for the key in labor. To him, wealth was not simply treasure piled in vaults. Wealth was the annual produce of land and labor, renewed through ordinary work. Smith's famous dinner line says we expect food not from the butcher's benevolence, but from his regard to his own interest. In the same sentence, Smith names the brewer and the baker too. A whole dinner built from strangers bargaining without intimate affection. That line is often read as cold. But Smith's point was stranger, society can cooperate even when love does not scale. You do not need the baker to adore you. You need rules, trust, habit, prices, and a world where promises usually hold. This is where bumper sticker Smith collapses. He was not saying greed is holy. He was saying self-interest can be harnessed or corrupted. He distrusted merchants when they gathered privately, not because trade was evil, but because power likes to dress itself as public benefit. Monopoly, privilege, and collusion frightened him. They bent the market away from workers and consumers toward those already close to government. The University of Glasgow notes that Smith's work still shapes debates on prosperity, institutions, markets, and inequality as the book reaches 250 years. The world Smith studied was not free market fantasy. It was imperial, regulated, unequal, and violent, stitched together by ships and chartered companies. Sugar, tobacco, cloth, and tea moved through systems of law and force. Smith's economics stood beside empire, not outside it. And there's no honest telling of 18th century wealth without naming slavery. Softly. Atlantic fortunes were built with coerced labor and human terror. Smith criticized colonial monopolies and the arrogance of empire, though he still wrote from within Britain's expanding world of commerce and conquest. That tension matters. He could see certain chains clearly and others only partly. Great thinkers still breathe the air of their age. Smith's earlier moral philosophy is essential because the Wealth of Nations never imagines people as numbers alone, however much counting it inspired. He believed humans seek approval, fear shame, imitate neighbors, and judge themselves through imagined spectators. Markets ride on this moral weather. So the invisible hand, though famous, is not a magic wand. It is one image in a much larger argument about unintended consequences. Smith cared about incentives because incentives shape conduct. Pay changes attention. Law changes courage. Scarcity changes what people dare to do. But he also feared what repetitive labor could do to the mind. The pin factory made abundance and could narrow a person's world. Division of labor produced astonishing output. It also made education a public concern, because citizens reduced to motions might lose judgment. Listen to that humane anxiety. A society can grow richer in goods while making some of its people poorer in imagination. The 2026 anniversary highlights not just a book's age, but its continuing role in arguments about growth, policy, and human flourishing. When you hear Smith invoked today, consider asking one question first. Which Smith? The moral philosopher, the market analyst, or the critic of privilege? The book's title asks about nature and causes. That is diagnostic language. Smith is less preacher than physician, taking society's pulse. He asks why some places accumulate skills, capital, roads, and security, while others remain trapped by poor institutions and blocked exchange. That question still bites. Why does opportunity cluster? Why do rules that look boring decide whether a child eats, learns, or works? Smith understood that prosperity is built from small arrangements, a road maintained, a contract honored, a monopoly broken, a worker trained. The drama is not always a battlefield. Sometimes it is a toll gate, a warehouse key, a price posted at dawn. And sometimes the villain is not a tyrant with a crown, but a committee of respectable men protecting their comfortable advantage. Glasgow celebrates Smith as student, professor, and rector, emphasizing how deeply the university shaped the intellectual roots of his economic thought. Imagine him lecturing in Glasgow, voice measured, students scratching notes, while outside the city's tobacco lords turned Atlantic trade into mansions. The city itself was an argument. Learning, commerce, inequality, ambition, and moral unease packed into stone streets slick with rain. What makes Smith endure is not that he solved capitalism, breath. It is that he saw economic life as human life under pressure. Prices are not just numbers, they are signals passing through hunger, weather, transport, fear, trust, and the bargaining power of neighbors. Labor is not just input. It is time taken from bodies, families, seasons, sleep, and the fragile dignity of being useful. Trade is not just exchange, it is geography made social, rivers, harbors, roads, debts, rumors, and strangers learning to rely on strangers. The Royal Society of Edinburgh identifies Smith's casual Pass Away the Time letter as the earliest known glimpse of the future masterpiece. There is something beautiful in that beginning. The book was not announced by trumpet. It grew from boredom, illness, friendship, and habit. David Hume, Smith's friend, knew ideas could unsettle nations. Their letters carried affection, wit, skepticism, and the courage of dangerous questions. Britannica places Smith among the great social philosophers, not merely economists, which helps explain why his economic arguments feel morally charged. One approach for the anniversary: read one famous Smith quote slowly, then ask what problem he was answering before turning it into doctrine. And if this episode helps you hear the past with more texture, a quick like or subscription keeps these deeper stories coming. Smith's afterlife became larger than Smith. Politicians, professors, bankers, revolutionaries, and critics each carved a usable ancestor from his work. Some made him a saint of laissez-faire. Others made him capitalism's defense attorney. Both versions can miss the worried observer at the desk. The real Smith is harder to weaponize. He praises exchange, warns against merchants, values education, attacks monopoly, and treats prosperity as fragile. That is why 250 years later, the book still feels alive, not because it flatters us, but because it interrogates us. It asks whether our systems reward useful work or protected advantage, whether growth enriches many lives or simply polishes the doors of the powerful. It asks whether we mistake motion for improvement. Firmly, more ships, more ledgers, more output yet. What happens to the people inside the machine? Consider holding two thoughts together. Markets can coordinate astonishingly well, and markets can be distorted by power, secrecy, and unequal starting points. That tension is not a footnote. It is the heartbeat of Smith's inquiry, beating beneath pins, prices, colonies, wages, and bread. The University of Glasgow's 250th anniversary program frames the wealth of nations as a living text for today's global economic questions. Maybe that is the anniversary's gift. It invites us to rescue a thinker from the slogans that made him convenient. Smith did not write a hymn to selfishness. He wrote a difficult map of dependence, showing how each dinner rests on countless unseen hands. Behind every loaf stand, farmers, millers, carters, bakers, laws, roads, credit, weather, and someone's hope that tomorrow's bargain will hold. A book begun to pass time ended up changing how nations imagined time itself, labor saved, wealth measured, futures planned, obligations counted. And on this 250th anniversary, Adam Smith still waits at the desk, asking not what markets worship, but what societies choose to value.